Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the same project. How are you today, sir?
Dry so far, but we'll see. We'll see.
It's a little rainy here in Austin as we record on Tuesday late morning, after morning. So, John, what to say? There's just been a ton going on in the last couple weeks, and in many ways, some of the stuff we kind of have on the bullet list for this week, we could have talked about last week, but we really wanted to kind of take a break and talk about Trump a little bit now.
Yeah, because we're sick.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a lot of intersecting developments in both state and national politics. So today we're going to kind of survey a development or two or three or four. But, speaking of Trump, first, though, and that's just, look, it's 2024.
Hey.
It's a presidential election year. It is going to be a Trumpy year one way or the other in terms of what we're all talking about. So first, we should add a little Texas angle to what is the dominant political story nationally coming out of the weekend, and that is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis dropping out of the Republican presidential nomination contest, the winnowing of the field to a two-person, air quote, contest, such as it is, between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley with, something of a showdown in New Hampshire today. I mean, it's an interesting heat check without, recapping all the national media stuff. New Hampshire, not really, if you're going to old comparative politics methodology, if you're going to plug the watermelon to sample it, if the watermelon is the Republican Party, if New Hampshire is the way you plug it, you're not really getting a representative sample of what is going on out there in Republican politics for the main part.
And I mean, just to take, we don't need to go into a lot of detail about this, but it is sort of like, it is interesting how much politics has moved in the last few decades when you look at sort of the role New Hampshire used to play, and people talk about, like, this is where you save your campaign. And we were kind of spending some part of the morning talking about, like, well, how bad could Nikki Haley lose and still want to go to her home state to lose again, probably?
Yeah. And
that's kind of what we're talking about here. I mean, it is like, it's not...
Right. Well,
it's not going to save her candidacy or something. I mean, the question is it going to prolong? Maybe I'm saying, is it going to prolong it?
And a good, we're not quite as, I'd like to think not quite as guilty, but, we're certainly susceptible as everyone else to, overinterpreting what's right in front of us sometimes, right? And so, the last several weeks have been all Iowa, New Hampshire, and, after Iowa, frankly, I was kind of like, okay, Iowa's caucuses are over. Don't really have to think about that for 3 point,
as long as we can manage
3+ years.
Right.
And there's an element of that to New Hampshire. As you were saying that, and we should say, one of our colleagues, the Jeremy Surrey, had dropped by as we were prepping for this, and we were just kind of kicking around what what does Haley need to get to go on, I think was kind of the way that Jeremy posed it. And now as I'm sitting here thinking about it, say Nick, and I do not think this is even close to, but hypothetically speaking, say Nikki Haley won New Hampshire.
Right, sure.
How would that actually change the dynamic of the race in the long term? I kind of suspect not much.
Yeah, unless
she would have to go. She'd have
to go on and win South Carolina,
and it would be harder for her to drop out.
Yeah, she couldn't drop out. She'd have to win South Carolina, which all indications are that she wouldn't. And then she'd have this sort of difficulty of like, well, you won New Hampshire, but you lost your home state and also a southern state, a much more sort of obviously Republican state. And it's probably much more indicative of the way the rest of the contest is going to go.
Right. And then you go on to Super Tuesday, which is, heavily favors Trump.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying I won't be, watching election returns tonight and keeping track of it. But look, we talked, as far as where this is right now, again, stepping back and, because we talked about it so much last week, we don't need to do it all again. We talked a lot about Trump's dominance in Texas last week. This, he's similarly dominant in most of the states that look Republican.
Well, to our colleagues, comment about whether Trump's support is strong or weak or whatever. There's a lot of different ways you can look at that.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that's going on sort of in the aftermath of Iowa is to sort of, in some ways, talk about DeSantis's failings as a candidate. And there's been a lot of that kind of going on in the lead up to Iowa about how, he entered with all this great promise and, and in some polls he was leading Trump early on and blah, 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 and all the blah, blah, blah. But you know what? Like, DeSantis was a strong candidate. Like, let's just take a step back for a second here. I don't mean that he didn't have missteps, but I mean, like, look, this is the whole thing. The idea like, DeSantis, had a problem, connecting with people or he had missteps. It's like, Donald Trump is your nominee. He is going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. So the idea that these things are in and of themselves like, the reason that he lost. Look, in our polling, DeSantis was at 62-12 fave-unfave among Republicans. He was only a little bit off of Trump when we were looking at, Republicans, at conservative Republicans. It wasn't as though this was a guy who was going into the race where a lot of Republicans had negative attitudes about him, or even like Trump drove up his negatives. The point is that Republicans had a choice in that race, and a lot of them were choosing between Trump and DeSantis, with Trump the heavy favorite. And when you looked at the second choices, a lot of the second choices for DeSantis would have gone to Trump. Yeah. And so, I mean, the way I look at it is sort of like, you can kind of say like, oh, well, DeSantis was like, no, DeSantis was is a governor of a very large state, raised a bunch of money, ran a national campaign for the first time against, basically an incumbent. Yeah, we'll see him again.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think so.
I think I'm probably a little less charitable towards DeSantis than that. I mean, I think that
I have been accused of being too charitable to
his numbers on paper. I would lead people say, look, he was a reasonable candidate. But I think, the factor you're emphasizing there, I think, is important, or that's embedded in there, is that, look, DeSantis was the argument.
Yeah.
The central argument of the DeSantis campaign all along was that they could get to the right of Trump in some key areas with more traditional conservative Republican primary voters and offer DeSantis as similar enough to Trump without the baggage.
Yeah, and that assumed that people cared about the baggage.
Right, and that was a fundamental miscalculation. But I also think there is a way in which, and I'd have to go back and look. I'm not sure that Trump didn't succeed in driving up DeSantis's negatives somewhat. I mean, maybe not here, but I think in the earlier states and nationally, I'm just not sure that's the case. But
yeah, I mean, this is all whatever, matters of degree. I mean, I would just say, I think it's easy to paint DeSantis dropping out as, him being a weak candidate in hindsight or whatever. But I think the reality is he was just a very, very distant second choice in most cases to Trump for most people. And that's how it played out. I mean, what's funny is that Haley is the one who's left because, if anything, at least her numbers in Texas haven't been as strong as DeSantis's throughout, the time we've been polling both of them. Yeah. And I think that's probably true generally. I mean, she's she's starting from a weaker position. Yeah,
I mean, I think, look, the most charitable version is, DeSantis, theoretically right guy, wrong time.
Yeah, that's right. That's the most charitable.
But I also, I have a lot of questions that, it does seem to me that the more we saw of him, the less well he played, and the less well he played with his core constituency, and certainly was, didn't have the raw material to move people. Now, maybe nobody does.
Well,
Look, and and the comparison with Haley is that Haley was and is, well, she's been trying to blur the distinction a little bit more. Campaigning from a completely different rationale. I mean, the reason for her race, the rationale was much different. So, anyway, like voters across the the country, Texas voters certainly don't prefer DeSantis to Trump, and here we are. He's gone. I have to say that when he was making sort of nods towards 2028. I find that kind of laughable, but, maybe that's just – I mean, I just don't see it. I see the moment having passed for him. But, okay, so a lot of other things happened last week. So a couple of quick hits before where do you want to start?
We'll just jump around real quick, try not to spend too much time on any of this. But, the Fifth Circuit, consistently known as the most conservative appeals court in the country, blocked Texas from enforcing its book rating law, which would have required booksellers to rate books based on the explicitness and relevance of the sexual references in this,
Yeah.
And without going into a lot of detail about this, I think it's notable, again, that the most conservative appeals court essentially sided on, First Amendment and also a mixture of both First Amendment grounds, but also the economic consequences of sort of requiring booksellers to come up with these rating systems. I think the thing we just want to point out is, we've been asking a lot about these kinds of questions about, access to books, public school libraries, public libraries, efforts to ban books in Texas. And without going into a ton of detail here, there's resistance to things that are aligned or adjacent to banning books. There's more of an appetite.
Yeah, it's fair to say, quote unquote, because somebody will come and say, we're not banning books, et cetera. But,
right. That's why I said aligned or adjacent.
Yeah,
I'm not saying,
right.
And that's right. I don't want to be fair here. But, there is more of an appetite around limiting what's available to minors, but it's still not as lopsidedly partisan as we think. The last time we looked at this, about 60% of Republicans were open to basically limiting what books are available to young people in libraries, but 30% were opposed to this idea. And so it's not...
And again, that's Republicans.
That's Republicans. So that's
right.
This is not a slam dunk. When we look at the electorate, and that leads to numbers in the electorate overall, it tends to find a majority of voters sort of against these kinds of efforts to limit, basically book access in one way or another. So that was an interesting thing that happened last week.
Yeah, that was one of those things that really carried over. We pay a lot of attention to these things when they're in the legislative process. You have these arguments, and it's only fair to note that there were a lot of doubts about the constitutionality of this.
Yeah.
Going in, and this is going to continue to be debated.
And it was also, to get to where they actually got on that bill, it took a lot of curious routes and a lot of torturing to kind of decide that this is what they were going to do. Yeah. And the fact that it kind of didn't end up, it didn't end up passing constitutional muster, not totally surprised, doesn't mean we won't be back to this at some point later.
Right. And the advocates and the supporters of this, obviously we're not banning books, we're, managing access. I don't think that argument ever completely took, but so what else? What else in the last couple of weeks? Well, big, just in the last couple of days, Supreme Court issued an order, and they didn't issue a decision in the case per se, but they issued an order allowing U.S. Border Patrol agents to remove concertina wire placed among the U.S.-Mexico border by the state of Texas, deployed by some combination, I think, of National Guard and DPS, but I think mostly National Guard, but at the order and at the behest and the order of the governor. This is just taking place among various disputes that have been ongoing between the federal government and state forces. Most recently, access to a park that the National Guard, wired off and restricted access to in Eagle Pass. Most importantly, refusing to allow Border Patrol access to the park. Border Patrol, was arguing that essentially this was preventing them from doing their constitutionally designated duty by the time we got to court on this. And it's interesting that the court issued this order. They're also, reviewing the Texas legislation. They're slated to give a more full hearing to Texas legislation, empowering state enforcement on the border and efforts on the border. It was interesting how in the run up to this last week, before the court ordered this decision, I got calls. I know you did. Lots of discussion in the media about, is there going to be, I think people had this vision of the National Guard and the Border Patrol sort of shooting it out at the border, look, I don't want to underplay the significance of this challenge by Texas to federal authority and to traditional constitutional understandings of who has authority at the border and where those lines are. That's interesting. That's going on. But, it speaks something to them, both the nature of media coverage in a generic kind of way, but also the mood around this, how quickly we went to that. in terms of, the kinds of questions I was getting, the discussion, the kind of implication in some of these stories and, that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think, coming on the heels, and we talked about this last week, of sort of Abbott's, pretty unfortunately framed comment about, essentially saying that, we're not shooting, immigrants crossing the border because we'd be charged with murder by the federal government.
Yeah, with the implication being otherwise.
Otherwise, yeah, open season. But I think to the extent that that was sort of the backdrop behind this conflict ongoing in this park in Eagle Pass, and it is interesting because, I mean, my understanding is that DPS is letting, other people go in. I could go into the park, apparently, if I just showed up and wanted to use the park. They're just not letting Border Patrol in.
Right.
And the idea here being is that they're not letting them in because the contention that they're essentially making is that Border Patrol is aiding and abetting the entry of migrants. Right. It's an interesting position to take, but I do think, I'm just thinking,
and that was the position taken in Texas filing with the court,
right? And so that's an interesting position. Ultimately, I don't know what Texas's end game is with this because really, it's either you're going to get the court to agree that the Border Patrol is aiding and abetting, or you're going to take over responsibility for securing the 1,200-mile border. It's. I'm sorry to say there's a certain amount of theater here, but hey, we're all adults. It's okay. The concertina wire thing I think is actually, a little bit more consequential in the short term, just because if you think about, the way that these stories were trending, to your point, last week, you think about Abbott's comment about, essentially murdering undocumented immigrants crossing the border. You think about this idea that people have the DPS is now standing there with guns, drawn.
Look, the implication is in order to prevent Border Patrol and federal authorities from helping migrants cross the border illegally.
Right. And so, but to go back, I think the way that those stories were trending last week was pretty negative for Texas, was probably a little bit negative for Abbott, in some ways, not necessarily with his core constituencies, but I think in terms of the overall direction of the coverage. But now with the Supreme Court saying, yeah, but the feds can go and cut that concertina wire, it's oh, so the federal government can go and cut the wire that's keeping out the immigrants?
Yeah, in terms of
there's something about this that's actually
in terms of how you game this out, I think
it's kind of a save.
Well, I think it's been a pretty consistent feature. I'm kind of thinking about this as I say it, but I think this is right. It's been a pretty consistent feature of how Abbott and his team have played this issue, in which the outcome of getting pushback or being sort of either courts or politically being pursuing this to its intermediate term logical end, to your point about what's the long term game, tends to break their way.
Yeah. No,
right?
I think look, like a lot of policy things, and this doesn't really happen on the border as much, but you're seeing this here is, in a lot of ways, Abbott is forcing Democratic elected officials at various levels and various to take positions that they don't really want to be forced to take. So all of a sudden, I'm a mayor in a liberal-leaning, very overly overwhelmingly Democratic city, and I have to be going out saying, "Stop sending these immigrants here." Right? That's not something they want to be doing.
And that's obviously like Exhibit A in how they did in stark political terms, they did a good job of kind of gaming this out.
Yeah, and I think this is a further part of this, is to the extent that the federal government is in the position of wanting to cut the barbed wire. That, if anything, is that becomes proof of the premise, right?
And if you watch the coverage of this on different kinds of news outlets, there's a battle of the semiotics here, right? Yeah. Because on one hand, the argument, so the Abbott team, Abbott administration has made the argument that Border Patrol is, now helping people through the wire. So you have, what are the images that get attendant to that, without even doing deep fakes or, using Chat GPT, you have a still image or a little bit of video of, these guys, Border Patrol agents, cutting the wire and, shepherding immigrants through. Now, the other semiotics that you see from the more critical side are, sort of pretty nasty looking injuries, that immigrants are getting. So, there's a basic kind of like, oh, these guys, they've been cut, they're sitting there bleeding. What is our obligation? Right. And I don't even mean that you could mean that in a big ethical sense. I just mean in terms of you're on the ground.
Right.
You're kind of what we, call first responders or, and, these people sitting there bleeding, depending on where they are vis-a-vis the Concertina wire, they might already be on U.S. soil. And so what are you supposed to do? And this, takes advantage of that, and the images work in the way that we're talking about. So, I think it's going to, obviously to really step back and thinking about, your question before, your comment before about how this plays out in the long term. Texas loses a lot of these cases.
Right.
We go to, Texas goes to court, Attorney General Abbott or Attorney General Paxton, get a lot of play in the state and nationally for challenging federal authority in various areas. They go to court. The courts work very slowly. If you think about, for example, voting legislation, you can think of more than one occasion in which the legislatures had to go back and tweak what they've done after the courts have told them they have to tweak it. There's a real long-term, medium-term, or short-term, medium-term, long-term political calculation in all of this, which is that, to my mind, the short and medium-term benefits, whether you're going to win or lose in court, are outweighing whatever is going to happen down the road.
Yeah,
pretty common in politics.
Yeah, I will say, though, the court process of this is moving a lot faster than it usually does, and partially that's because, you've got Border Patrol with guns and you've got DPS and with guns. It's an emergent situation that, requires, an exigent response, right? But, it is, again, nobody, I'll say this, there's no aspect of this, I don't think, that, the governor and all of those in part, all those sort of making these decisions aren't aware of and aren't gaming out themselves. And right now it's looking pretty okay for them. That's kind of how I would say.
And the politics of that, are work for them.
So a couple other things from last week here.
Yeah.
Right? So, the DOJ released its comprehensive report on the mass shooting in Uvalde. And, the main sort of takeaway, I think, that was sort of the headline in the news was, the significant failures on the part of law enforcement in this. I noticed that the report was like 500 pages longer than the House report, which I thought was, not trying to be that kind of professor,
You're saying size matters, huh?
It sometimes, to some people, back in August, we asked people about the factors that they thought, or voters, what they thought were the major factors that led to the sort of the severity of the mass shooting.
And this was August of 22, which was pretty proximate.
Right.
Yeah.
And what we found was, not surprisingly, 3/4 of voters said it was the delay by police in confronting the shooter. The next highest number was in the 40s, where you saw, flaws in school safety practices, weaknesses in the mental health system and the weapon. But those were all up in the 40% range. But 75% of voters basically, it was the police response. So in some ways, affirming what people had already, the conclusion people had already arrived at, doesn't, make a difference going forward. I don't know. We'll see. There has been some movement on the legal front. Apparently, a grand jury was impaneled in Uvalde. Apparently, but nobody really knows
what's going to happen.
Or what even they're really doing yet. So that remains ongoing.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting the degree to which, and look, part of this is that this is a little overdetermined.
Yeah.
Right, in the sense that I think there are very few people. Let's put it. It's a relatively rare instance of something with a lot of profile, in which there's a lot of partisan disagreement on the failings of the emergency response, right? And so, I think, and we talked about this a bit at the time. I don't think there's any way to resolve this because because the failure was so egregious and is so well documented. And again, to go to the the semiotics of these things, a theme today, I guess, or at least so far, the imagery really supports this argument. Now, that's not always that can be misleading. Yeah. But in this case, the alignment between, all of this video footage we've got, if you watch the national news coverage when the report was issued on, probably the 6 or 7 instances that I saw, and again, just a not random sample, but, across networks and cable, one of the things that you saw, most frequently was the section of the school camera, and I don't think, maybe it might have been one of the body cams of, one of the law enforcement, officers running down the hall. You see the smoke coming from the shots, and then he runs back. Yeah. And that's become kind of emblematic of what happened.
Yeah.
we wrote at the time, and I still think this is out there, but it's just the nature, and again, I think it's fair but unfortunate. We know that the gun, the presence of the firearm that was there, lots of documentation that there was a lot of chatter saying, hey, he's got a high-powered assault rifle. We're going to wait until, various things might happen to make it more safe. Was a pretty big part of this, but because that folds into the much more human story, I think, of, and more apparent, as we said, that, like there was a failure of, strategy, planning, and just a failure to act. And I think that, that makes such intuitive sense to people.
Yeah.
Particularly given the evidence. And again, I'm not saying that it's not right. I mean, I think it's right. But it really just overpowers, the discussion of anything else that might have, of other things that contributed to this.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to put it. I mean, I started thinking, and I'm not disagreeing or agreeing. I'm just thinking about what you said. And it is interesting to consider the fact of, people talk a lot about, like the school safety practices and whether the doors were locked or not, and the organization or disorganization of the incident command, and
something that was relatively newer and more detail in this, and
the triage process,
the triage and medical response is really a horrible.
I don't want to talk about it, But the thing about that is, you sort of have to take a step back and say, in a situation like that, you can understand why a person might be inclined to say, oh, that door's locked. And why someone else might say, oh, okay.
Yeah, right.
Because, with basically, the smoke flying, the high-powered machine, all of a sudden it's like, are you going to jiggle your keys?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this is the thing. People become motivated to see what they want to see, to believe what they want to believe. And, even in a situation like that.
Right. And I think in this case, what it's done is that, it hasn't led to anything that I think is fundamentally misleading, but if you will, it places negative and positive coefficients on certain things.
Yeah, for sure.
Certain elements of the explanation.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, we're getting down to, we're trying to talk about this in the dorkiest way possible, but I 100% agree with the way you're thinking about this. And that's exactly, I was avoiding talking about it that way, but yes. There's a lot of correlation between these factors, and it takes a little bit of disentangling to think about what really was doing what here. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It is one of those things. I don't know. It's just one. We'll come back to.
And it kind of comes up at it's kind of come and gone pretty quickly as a story. I mean, it was a big story last. Yeah. I think, we've heard Roland Gutierrez's campaign, of course, in the Democratic Senate primary. Has tried to use this to sort of move their issues back to the center, or center of the discussion. And I think. So what else did we see? So we can move on from that. We got another couple things on the bullet list. Campaign finance reports came in last week. A lot of people looking at lots of things there.
A lot of things to look at.
Right? Who. How much money is being raised in these House races. Particularly on the Republican side, who's spending money, who's not spending money now, and what does that mean? Does it mean they're probably sitting on it for the last, to avoid it being reported in some cases? The element that really kind of made news was the campaign finance report from the governor, right? Yeah.
So, amongst sort of 19 million or so brought in during the reporting period, about 6 million of that donation, this is to the governor, came from a single Pennsylvania businessman who's apparently a big school voucher proponent. And that was sort of, it was notable because one, it was, I think, the single largest, one-off kind of contribution in Texas history. It sort of goes into the list of sort of Abbott, mega donor kind of instances that people talk about. But it's also notable because it led to a lot of people asking questions. So is that $6 million going to go straight into House races against?
Does that get earmarked?
Yeah, is that earmarked basically to go after, basically the Republicans who voted against a voucher plan, right? Because I was sort of doing some quick math this morning. You think, about 26 divided, 6 million divided by 26, about 230,000. A pop. That's a lot of money to potentially drop on, to carpet bomb a campaign in the last week if you wanted to.
Right, try to move a lot of things at once.
So this is one of those, like a lot of this right now, it's kind of a wait and see what he does, wait and see how much he spends. But I think people, are reasonably looking at it and thinking, he could spend $6 million on those 20 races and just, go crazy.
Well, and remember, he's also endorsing a lot of incumbents.
Right.
Including incumbents that voted for vouchers. So that could also wind up being
You look for the good side of human
for some
nature.
of those guys. Well, I don't know if that's the good side or the bad side. It's I'll tell you what, it's good for the governor if you said, okay, here's a big pot of voucher money. That means that's money, non-voucher money you don't have to spend to defend some of these incumbents and still get the credit for it.
I mean, I've been road testing this idea. We'll move on from this in a second, but I'll say it here. I don't think I said this last week, but I'll make this again. I mean, I think that's a good point, and I think it would be wise for the governor to shower that money in both directions if he's planning to. And part of it, I mean, just to say, like, if he does, we were to take, the fire and brimstone approach and say that $6 million is to go after, those Republicans who didn't support me on vouchers. He's not going to bat, 1,000, right? Some of those guys are going to come back through. And now all of a sudden, you've got people looking at the governor who seems to hoover up like a huge amount of money in the state, who's now taking, again, donations basically from out-of-state businessmen, earmarked to basically go after incumbents in his own party. That I'm not saying that is going to happen, but it does create the environment that allows for somebody to say, hey, maybe we should put some limits on this.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't know. I know. All I'm saying is it creates the possibility of the environment. It doesn't mean that that's what happens, but there's a popular narrative out there that campaign finance reform happens when there's some kind of scandal or something.
Right.
And that's not really when campaign finance reform happens. Campaign finance reform happens when the out party and enough of the in party don't like the way resources are getting distributed. And that's all I'm saying. I mean, it's sort of the dynamics are kind of setting up in a way that if Abbott's not careful, he is going to give a lot of people a reason to say, Texas is a limited government place. Does the governor need to have $37 million in his bank account when he's not up for re-election? Let's say,
what I would say in terms of pointing to recent.
I'd also add Patrick taking the $3 million before the Paxton trials, another sort of recent example here of, problematic optics.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just.
I think the last time that somebody kind of pursued this along those lines and thought that, and I think it was based on that kind of an argument, was, the Lyle Larson legislation trying to, and it was a very comparatively mild.
Very mild.
Trying to, limit the time that contributors could be, become gubernatorial appointees and things like this.
Sure.
And that would be Lyle Larson, who's no longer in office.
He was very much out on an island when he did that. I mean, like on that issue and in general, right? And then Abbott ended up spending money against him and a couple others in that cycle. But I mean, here's the thing. I mean, look, it worked that time. I mean, the sense that Abbott basically made very clear that, like, okay, you can pursue that kind of approach with me, but I'm going to veto it, and also you should know, like, I'm going after you.
Right.
But the thing is, at this point, it's one thing to say I'm going to go after 3 members. It's another thing to say I'm going to go after 20, 23 members, 30 members. It's another thing to say I'm going to do that. And also, by the way, I'm going to get a $6 million check from some out-of-state business person specifically to go after you. Right. I mean, it's changing the calculus a little bit versus, Lyle Larson on his way out, Well,
I don't know that Lyle Larson was on his way out purposefully when he did that.
No. Well, no. I mean, he was practically, but that's a different question.
He had defined himself as kind of, obviously not on the reservation.
Yeah, exactly. Which is harder and harder to do. Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm skeptical, but we'll see.
No, I'm not saying it's going to. I'm just saying it's interesting. It's an interesting set of conditions to my mind. You know?
Sure.
I mean, because ultimately, ultimately, it is up to the legislature. I mean, the legislature does have the power to change the dynamics of the way this works, and they could. And if you're a House member, nobody's writing you a $6 million check.
Yeah.
Right,
okay. But if you're in the Senate and they've written Dan Patrick a check, it's not moving through there anyway.
Well, I've been thinking about this too, so that's right.
Unless Patrick, there's a lot of questions there.
There's a question about Patrick's piece of that. I mean, I think the other thing about this is you wonder, this is where I start to wonder, we haven't talked about this, but about, let's say those senators who might have feel as though they're getting squeezed either on the Paxton stuff or on other things, looking at Patrick and also feeling the same kind of way about it.
Yeah.
Again, I'm just saying there's some conditions out there. I'm not saying they get activated. It's just interesting to look at.
I think that, it would require a kind of perception of interest along the lines you're talking about, and also some, risk aversion.
Yeah.
That I'm not, or some risk insensitivity that I've not seen in evidence.
Oh, well, no, none of that.
But, things could change.
Yeah.
So to wind up, one of the biggest stories on the ground in Texas from the last week or so, from a very Texas-centric perspective, also intersects both Abbott and the Texas primary, GOP primary. And, after the Texas Supreme Court last week ruled against AG Ken Paxton's efforts to avoid having to give testimony under oath in the whistleblower's ongoing lawsuit against the AG, Paxton announced that he would no longer contest the facts of the whistleblower lawsuit and was, I think in their words, prepared to accept a judgment in the case without further litigation, which was, I think, an interesting kind of way to pose that. In effect, Paxton's office has officially kind of abandoned the denial that was at the heart of part of his impeachment trial defense, which is that, denying that he violated the Whistleblower Act. He's now essentially saying, we're gonna stipulate those facts to try to make this, go away. And the statements on social media and the official statements and the statements of his defenders all try to play that in a different way, that this was really saving the taxpayers more money. Right. I've got more important things to do. I've got to go continue suing the federal government and fighting the fentanyl epidemic, et cetera. But in the end, this seemed like Paxton got put in a box, and it was a pretty stunning turn of events in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think for anyone who watched, the trial closely, and we acknowledge all throughout it was not a legal. I mean, I said the trial in the Senate, it was not a legal trial, it was a political trial, and it felt like it, and it read like it, and it looked like
laid out in a legalistic way that ultimately helped him. But,
it was legal when it was helpful for it to be legal, and it was not really so much when it didn't need to be. But, if you spent, at least part of the summer watching that, the idea of going from, sort of this full-throated, not only, I would say, it's not even a saying that, defensive actions, but endorsement of actions, saying, if anything, what was going on by the whistleblowers was a coup, and in fact, not only was it, in his right to fire these people, he was legally bound, he was legally able to do so. In fact, he should have fired them, right? And then you go from that to, well, we're not going to contest the facts as the whistleblowers lay them out.
Yeah.
And basically, I mean, it's hard not to connect some dots here. I mean, I think the fact that the Supreme Court earlier in the week said, look, any effort you're going to have to shield yourself and your top deputies from testifying under oath in a real court of law, right? We're not going to do that. And the fact that a few days later they say, okay, well then, you know what? We're going to take our ball and go home. Tell us how much this costs.
Sure makes it seem like they're trying to pay their way out of it, or, buy their way out of it. And they even admitted, look, not they, but, it inevitably, raised the discussion of, well, do we think that the settlement number is going to go down?
Well, it's got to go up.
And that's right. And so that means, do we think when the legislature was unwilling to pay the previous amount that they're now going to want to pay the other amount?
Yeah, I mean,
seems like, and so, just in terms of getting some of the, so as of now, the judge in the case has set a date for Paxton to testify, which is well before the primary, February 1st.
Right.
And with dates for whistleblower testimony, in about a week and a half period after February 1st.
So there's sort of two things going on here, and I think it's probably worth trying to separate them, at least for the discussion and just, think for thought, right? There's the actual process of this trial and what happens, right? I mean, ultimately they could go back and negotiate a settlement. Again, I would be shocked if it wasn't a higher number than the $3.3 million.
It would have to be,
it has to be, right? They can go forward, with the trial and have the judge set it or whatever. Again, we're not lawyers, but there's that whole piece of it. And your point, I think, is right. I think there is a funny part of this if you're Ken Paxton and his allies. Like, yeah, okay, we'll just kick this back to the legislature and let them deal with it next session and see if they'll pay it, right? And have them deal with it or not. But there's another piece of this, which is this is attached to the primary. And what's interesting is to the extent that, Paxton has gone on his variously described air quotes revenge tour against the many, many House Republicans who voted for his impeachment, it does raise the question of whether that effort stands. I mean,
how much does this take the air out of that balloon?
I mean, because it does seem to me that at this point, again, you're speaking about the social media response. I mean, the social media response from some of the House managers of the impeachment trial, and among others, was pretty, Yeah,
it wasn't even just social media. I mean, the investigating committee issued a statement under Andrew Murr's signature, the chair, that was pretty scathing.
Yeah, I mean,
And put all these things together. And again, nobody should be surprised by that. But.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the things that was remarkable about this from the jump was, the fact that they clearly violated whistleblower laws. I mean, that would seem the most obvious piece of this, kind of just from the basic fact pattern. As much as that was pushed back against in the impeachment trial, the fact that, again, now we're in an actual trial and they're just saying, no, that happened is interesting. But then the question becomes, again, from what I've been following of some of these local races and what I've seen kind of in the press coverage, it's not as though the challengers to these incumbent Republicans aren't leaning heavily on the Paxton piece. It seems like that from what I've seen. And again, I can't speak to all the races. I can only speak to the ones that I've seen coverage of. But when that's kind of what I'm curious about is how much of these candidates, is the Paxton endorsement and the impeachment vote, is it part of a broader package challenging incumbents, or is it the main rationale? And it seems in a lot of cases more like it's the main rationale. And it seems like that rationale has just been totally popped. Yeah. Because there's an easy response. If you're an incumbent, you say, they're not the state of Texas is under Ken Paxton's direction. The state of Texas is no longer even contesting that they didn't fire the whistleblowers.
Well, I guess the question I have, and I don't think the coverage necessarily, to be fair, I don't think the coverage necessarily helps us with this. You may have some candidates trying to unseat incumbents that voted against Paxton.
Yeah.
Who saw this as an opportunity. Mm-hmm. Right now, whether the rationale for taking this opportunity is how much of that is the public face of these campaigns, I just don't know. Look, we've been talking about, we've polled on how much people paying attention to this, and the results seem like this is. People have heard about it, but it doesn't seem, amazingly salient. The public opinion data that we have is, I think, ambiguous on this as well.
Yeah,
it's not entirely salient. You look at Paxton's job approval numbers; they've recovered to a mediocre point.
Yeah,
among Republicans, you wouldn't call them weak.
No,
and so, when I say, have they let the air out of the balloon, I'm still not sure how much air was in this balloon to begin with in terms of actual voting decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that, as we well know, if you strategize to use this as an opportunity to recruit and incentivize and attract funding for challengers to incumbents, that does a lot of lifting.
Yep.
And that's so the balloon is, there's a balloon there to torture the metaphor. But, it still seems to me a little vague over just how much, this is really driving voting decisions. And it's hard for me to imagine this helps in any way.
No.
I just don't know if it hurts, how much it hurts. Maybe, we can, we're talking about ways to try to figure this out, right? In terms of polling, but even that, it's difficult.
Well, and the thing is,
particularly at the level of a House race.
To your point, I don't think it has any sort of major impact either way. I mean, the question is sort of the possibility of it helping and hurting in some sort, to my mind, in sort of a bank shoddy sort of sense. To the extent that there are some candidates out there challenging incumbents whose total reason for running is the Paxton vote, and that's the opportunity that led them to run, and this is what they're going to base their candidacy around. Look, that probably has an impact because if you're an incumbent, you have a ready-made answer now at this point. To the extent this comes up. Now, at the same time, one of the things I keep thinking about is these funding questions. A lot of people have pointed out that two things kind of come out of this. One of the things that I think is interesting is that Paxton, look at campaign finance reports, Paxton spent a ton of his available cash on his legal defense.
Right.
And so, at least as where Paxton stands at the moment, he doesn't have a ton of money to throw around in these races himself. So, he can throw around his own endorsement. He can go and do events.
Yeah, and he's been doing, both of that.
Right,
both of those.
Of course. The other sort of related development, and none of this is determinative, and I'll say why in a second, is the Defend Texas Liberty PAC, which was sort of his big backer, has been notably quiet thus far in primary season. Now, part of that has to do with their dalliance, if you will, with neo-Nazis and sort of the bad press that came out of that. It's also hard not to wonder how much of that is also related to the fact that, once Paxton says, hey, I'm not, contesting this, whether they want to pull back in terms of how much money they're going to spend. Now, at the same time, as we've already pointed out, excuse me, it's very possible that, if you think about the funders behind Defend Texas Liberty, in fact, you think about Ken Paxton's biggest funders, they can spend as much money as they want. They can spin up an operation very, very quickly. And if they want to spend, $100,000, $200,000, a couple $100,000 in the closing days of a campaign to say that someone's not sufficiently conservative or someone voted to impeach Ken Paxton, there's not enough money or time for incumbents to really respond to that in any sort of serious way.
Well, that's the campaign chess game, right?
And that's the campaign chess game. And so we kind of have to just wait and see.
Yeah, you've got the other elements out there. I mean, there's a lot of countervailing factors. I mean, I think, a couple of things about, we've been talking offline about this Defend Texas Liberty spending question. The other thing to remember is that, there's a lot of countervailing factors here.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, who's using who here?
Yeah.
Right. In terms of Paxton and Defend Texas Liberty. Defend Texas Liberty has a lot of other irons in the fire other than Ken Paxton.
Yep.
Right. And not that they, he's, their guy and all this kind of thing. But a lot of other things going on in that they're interested in. And also remember, there's a few more, a little more than 24, I think, give or take, candidates in which Abbott and Paxton are on the opposite side.
Right.
And, look, this, again, varies from district to district, and it varies a lot, frankly.
Yeah, yeah.
All things being equal, if you ask me if I'm a House member in a close race, would I rather have Abbott's backing or would I rather have Paxton's backing right now? I think you'd rather have Abbott.
I would 100% agree with that.
Right. And so, at some point, where the rubber meets the road here in the last couple of weeks, again, a lot of things we don't know here. That's why we have these elections, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about a very small subset of the electorate. And very small, very, very small electorates in these individual races, where, I think your average, about 15,000 votes or something in these races. If you have people who are really ginned up, you're looking at 25,000, maybe a little more,
Well, and that's one of the things about this, we say things are endogenous, again, when it ends, no matter what happens, we're going to hear claims by everybody about how they were the deciding factor, how they're so powerful. I mean, one way or another, you'll hear about Abbott's role in the primary or Paxton's role in the primary or, how the true conservatives spoke up. And whatever, and there's two things, is that one, it's almost certainly the actual picture is going to be much, much muddier. But two, when you look at someone like Abbott who has so much resources, he is, again, we're talking about those last minute buys, right, in the chess matches. But what's not going on? Polling. Or that's not going on last minute. What's going on right now is the polling. And so ultimately, they're not going to play in races where they're not going to have the impact that they want to have,
and
or they don't have the chance to.
There's a lot of polling going on in these House races being done by, interested parties that we're not seeing publicly, or at best we're seeing, and this hasn't really started quite as much that I've seen, but in the next
start getting leaked.
In the next couple of weeks, we're going to start seeing a lot of, leaked campaign polling.
Right. And so the thing is, when you start to see
selectively released, I shouldn't even say.
Yeah, selectively released. And so exactly. So I think, once we start seeing, where does Paxton really put in effort? Where does he start really doing events once we get closer to those elections? Where does Abbott really start spending money, start, putting ads out? Ultimately, that's not a random subset. It's not even going to be all of the potential targets. It's going to be the targets where they know that they've got the highest probability of success, so that afterwards they can say, see, look, I was right. The voters are with me. But they're not going to necessarily go and just, scattershot every possible race and see which ones they can get, because, they're smarter than that.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, everyone's going to have probably a lot more confidence in targeting rather than random strategy. Right now,
but this,
I would say that may or may not be right.
But I think this
actually,
is, but I'd say this, this is important. I mean, look, knowing the type of people who listen to a podcast like this, I think it'll be really interesting, after the fact, and thinking about, how this gets covered. If Abbott goes and says, yeah, look, I knocked off 4 incumbents, and you want to say, how many races did they spend more than $20,000 in, or whatever the threshold is? Oh, did they spend, did they spend that in 20, 30 races and they knocked off 3? Then you might, come to a different conclusion than to say, oh, wow, you knocked off 4 incumbents.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
what you'll see is what we see all the time is, the the selection of the denominator that most benefits them when they're looking at their, at their success rates. And, so what they'll if the normal pattern holds, there isn't that much turnover, maybe a little more just based on there being a larger universe.
Right.
You're going to see the defense of pro-voucher incumbents folded into the success rate.
Exactly. And I think the point here is that, because of that window after the election, you have this period where, the election occurred, you get some results, the interested parties start, basically tallying up all the wins that they feel like they have, right? So they can make that claim. But we're still waiting for the campaign finance report. We're still waiting for the final vote data. And those stories get written. And then about a week or two later, you can start to say, well, actually, wait a minute.
Right. And by that time, the audience for that stories is, pretty small.
Yeah, and so this is to say, my only prediction here is to say, expect it to be muddled and muddy, but that's on purpose, and expect, again, I think everybody to claim victory.
And I should qualify that. The public audience is pretty small, but it's the kind of thing that insiders will be looking at to handicap, what the balance of power is between different ideological sectors, different interest groups, different factions in the House and the Senate. But still a lot to develop on there. So with that, thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. You can find data we talked about, past podcasts, lots of posting by Josh and I in various combinations at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thank you, of course, for listening. Keep in touch, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.